Okay, and welcome to the Identity and Autonomy chapter. So, let's start with the idea of self-concept. So, kind of the idea, before you have a sense of identity, it's kind of starts more primitively with like, who am I? What's important to me? What are my values? So, if you think about asking, a 6, 7-year-old who they are, think about for a second, what might they say, right? They might say, I'm a girl, I'm a boy, I play soccer, I do this. Pretty basic, kind of that Piagetian, more concrete in their way of thinking rather than more abstract. And if I asked you to really think about it, who you are, it's probably, there's more, I think, a deeper sense of who you are, maybe things that are important to you, your values. It's more than just boy, girl, brown hair, whatever. But also, if you look on the slide that says the multiple selves of a 15-year-old girl, it almost seems funny. But in reality, that's I think, a good depiction of it. And what that little kind of diagram is showing you is that it's complicated, and even there are different senses of self-concept in different places or different settings. So at home, you are maybe one way. At school, you might be one way. With certain people, you're a certain way. When you're at one extracurricular, you're with one way. So sometimes there's a lot of consistency, and then sometimes there's inconsistency. So these kind of conflictual or differing self-concepts, when you kind of bring them all together, are there a lot of contradictions, right? And that might make kind of the sense of identity of who they really are on a deeper level, lending itself towards like personality, kind of taking root, could make it more complicated. So I kind of jokingly we'll talk about a sense of false identity in a little bit. And what that means is kind of an identity that perhaps isn't consistent with maybe who you are, or acting like fake. That's what a lot of teenagers will call it. She's being fake, or she's not being genuine with such and such a person. So I'm sure some of you, either within yourselves or friends, or probably those younger siblings, some of them might be like in a romantic relationship. We're most likely to be a false self, or like kind of a fake self, when we're maybe trying to impress somebody, or when we're maybe more insecure. So I had a friend who would kind of take on the persona of the person that they were dating all the time. So maybe for one week a couple weeks they'd be into like country music, but they never were before. Or, now they're really into becoming a vegan when they, used to be the one who was spearheading trips to, fast food chains with burgers. So anyway, just kind of thinking about that. It's pretty normative to have some kind of differences. We're sometimes a little bit crabbier at home, or we might be a little bit more open with certain friends compared to others. But if there's a lot of discrepancies, that could contribute to issues. So other things that are, again, whether it's kind of on the very conscious level, or sometimes on this more subconscious level, there's a sense of who am I actually, and some people are more accurate in their descriptions than others about who they are, and having an accurate sense of self. It's always good to be pushing for that ideal self. We all should be kind of striving towards something. Not necessarily that your entire identity of self should be different, but a little bit of where am I trying to go, especially as an adolescent, as you're still growing up. What do you want to be? What's your ideal person or style? And then a feared self, like, oh my gosh, so maybe my dad was not kind, or wasn't around, so I would be afraid to be that same type of parent or something. That's not true in my actual case. I'm just giving an example. So that false self behavior, like I said, kind of being inauthentic, and in general, like, we're not super tolerant. Teenagers in general aren't super tolerant of tolerating their friends being not genuinely themselves. So, sometimes you have those friends who are going to call you out on when you're acting not consistent. This also feeds into like self-esteem issues, which is one of those like ever-moving targets. That is one of those things that if I could have a medication to improve self-esteem for teenagers, I certainly would. There's this kind of funny, I think, contrast, though, if you think about teenagers. There's a lot of that narcissism. I always think of like, how many selfies can you possibly post? How narcissistic are you? But again, it relates a little bit more to egocentrism, thinking you're the center of the universe, as opposed to thinking you're so amazing. Or maybe it's some of these decisions to post things is linked to maybe overcompensating, or trying to control your image that you're projecting because it's a little bit fragile. So there are two general types of self-esteem I want you to have a sense of. So one is baseline, like where are you generally, right? As a whole, are you somebody, you can think of, again, yourself, your friends, your family. Some people are pretty confident, have a nice, high, consistent sense of self-esteem. That's their baseline self-esteem. Some people, are genuinely or generally pretty low on their self-esteem. But what's their kind of overall? Most days they have high self-esteem. Most days you have low self-esteem. Most days you're somewhere in the middle. But then there's called a barometric self-esteem, like a barometer, which is kind of moving, depending on pressure, I guess, kind of frequently in flux. And what that means is there are certain types of, whereas we have more of a constant sense of where our self-esteem is overall, depending on the area or the place or the people that we're with, self-esteem is likely to fluctuate. So perhaps you love like literature and English and foreign languages, and in those types of classes you feel really confident and you have a high self-esteem. But as soon as you walk into that math class or the physics class or chemistry or something, your self-esteem might plummet. For me, I would say I have fairly good baseline self-esteem, but in an athletic arena, my barometric, self-esteem tends to dip. That's not an area where I have extreme confidence. If I'm playing on some kind of a co-ed softball league, I'm just praying that the ball doesn't come to me. So I think it's nice to sometimes have a sense of like, it's not all or nothing. Trying to really, facilitate self-esteem growth and in areas for kids where you see them kind of shining, and again, maybe minimizing some of the importance of areas that they don't really care about. So that's why I put kind of all my eggs more in this academic basket, because it wasn't happening. I was never going to be some kind of professional athlete. So yeah, again, and self-esteem is so critical, and it's one of those things that's really hard to transfer to someone, right? And so a lot of it is, usually when you have high levels of, academic success tends to lead to high self-esteem. Just having high self-esteem doesn't necessarily translate to high academic success. It doesn't go that way. We tend to have more volatile self-esteem earlier on, and it gets much better over time. But those who have a lot of really volatile self-esteem, very unstable senses of self, or those who seem to get their sense of, self-esteem or confidence from others, are going to have a really hard time. So they're going to be more prone to anxiety, depression, doing more poorly in school, irritability. Psychosomatic symptoms are like things like headaches, stomach aches, and irritability. And then you can also see just that one slide gives you, I think it's slide 9, talks about the different areas of self-esteem that someone might have. So it's not just in one area. And as trends, males tend to have higher self-esteem than do females, and you can kind of speculate and think a little bit about why, but there's some good data to talk about why. Again, a lot of this relates to things like idealized body image, being kind of more physically vulnerable because of size and things like that. Middle class tends to have higher self-esteem than lower SES, and then African American females tend to have higher self-esteem, and African Americans in general too. A lot of that is because of like a part of what they're building up, like strength in the community, as opposed to maybe looking at the more negative, critical ways in which maybe like there's a lot more about like body pride in the African American community, and more of a sense of kind of just community in general, and so that's something that's shown to contribute to higher self-esteem in African Americans. And so, again, and also it's especially likely if you have a stronger sense of ethnic identity. That's positive for you. And I like this slide, the antecedents and consequences of high self-esteem. So, again, it's more important to get self-esteem from your parents, from success in school, peer support, as opposed to getting self-esteem solely from a romantic interest, a friend at school. Because their self-esteem is kind of volatile too. You don't want to rest your self-esteem laurels on other people who are a little more volatile. Again, back to identity. As we know, the big crux is for adolescents is identity versus role confusion, and I think Erickson talked about it really well. There's 4. It's kind of back to that parenting kind of quadrangle where you're looking at identity exploration as a function of kind of exploration versus commitment. So on the ideal side, it tends to be that you would have high exploration, and then high commitment would be kind of the ideal outcome. But but then there's things along the way. And some of you might circle through all of these before you get to the final one. I'm sure you're hovering down towards identity, achievement. But so on the lower end, if you have absent commitment and exploration is present, it's called moratorium. So you're kind of looking, but you haven't quite committed yet. And that's kind of like freshmen in college. A lot of them are in moratorium. And it sounds like this horrible term. It reminds me of death, but it's not. You're still at least exploring. But if some people are like constantly exploring and never seem to commit, and you can see how these categories can have implications not only for your identity, but perhaps for relationship development, for political party affiliation. It's not just about identity. So some people are constantly exploring a little too much with romantic relationships and not committing, right? And there's some cons with that. Identity foreclosure is basically that you commit in some ways prematurely and you're not really exploring. So that person who, my dad is a dentist, my grandfather was a dentist, my mom's a dentist, so therefore I will be a dentist. And you never really look at anything else. Sometimes those people can have really good outcomes, but I think in general, kind of committing too early without giving yourself that room to explore is, not ideal. And then identity diffusion, you're just like, I don't know what you're doing. You're playing a lot of video games in your parents' basement perhaps, but you're not really exploring. You certainly haven't committed and you're just a little bit lost. So those are the examples there. And you can read some more negative. One other example in there, it's not on that kind of, diagram, but there's something called a negative identity where it kind of goes more of these extreme negative examples. So, something like I'm going to join ISIS, or I'm going to, most people would agree that that's not a good identity. Or I'm going to just, go and do drugs all day, those kinds of things where you might be going against what, or a sociopath or a serial killer, those things aren't great. The last thing I want to talk about really briefly is ethnic identity development. And this is further complicated by the fact that, there's more and more people, of like multiple backgrounds and mixed backgrounds. And, so it's one of those things where many people are biracial or triracial, and, having children with other people who are, biracial and whatever. Sometimes it makes it really complicated for kids. Very high rates of individuals who are biracial. And then there's a really good, it's like a little video that I'll try to send you about individuals who are of like mixed backgrounds that maybe don't look like they fit in directly with one group or the other, and how, people kind of look at them and talk about the different, like, how people, it's something that's very physical. So maybe you look African American, but you have a Caucasian other parent, and some people might like, kind of pigeonhole you into being African American when you really identify with both. And so it's something that you have your own intrinsic identity, your sense of ethnic identity, but how others view you it's going to affect you in some ways, or it may affect you. So just keep that in mind. It's kind of interesting. Ethnic identity, now again, this is a little bit of a value judgment. The book, or a lot of theorists would say, okay, the idealized outcome is bicultural. And the two kind of dimensions on this, in this kind of identity development model, is either identification with the majority group or identification with your ethnic group. Most would say it's bicultural, identifying strongly with both. But that's kind of a personal preference, and that may not be ideal. It depends. So if you identify strongly with the majority group and you weakly identify with the ethnic group, that would be more of assimilation, where you're just assimilating with the majority culture. You moved here from China, you kind of don't really engage in your Chinese culture, and you're only kind of Americanized. Separated would be that you are only identifying with the ethnic group. So maybe you come here from China, you only associate with people from China, and you really have nothing to do with the kind of mainstream culture in the U.S. So that would be separated. And then marginalized is like, you take or leave either one of them. You're not really connected with either. So sorry to go so quickly on that. But but just keep in mind, it's much more complicated with how others might view you, or when you don't have a really, maybe you think about your own ethnic identity. Is that a big part of who you are? Is it a small part of who you are? That's something to really consider. But I think it is interesting when you have your own sense of who you identify with, or what ethnic group or which ethnic groups you identify with, and how others might project what they assume yours is onto you. That could be kind of an issue that a teenager might deal with. Okay, bye.